Picture yourself entering the opulent silence of a grand Renaissance palazzo. Heavy oak doors close gently behind you, sealing away the world outside. Every step that you take reverberates softly. Candles flicker gently, casting elongated shadows that dance upon high walls that are adorned with portraits of nobility. A whole series of faces, proud, unsmiling, silently demanding respect. From the shadows emerges your host, the Duke, his presence immediately commanding, yet impeccably polite. His clothing is immaculate. Velvet robes rustle softly, exuding wealth, privilege, and an unmistakable air of dominance. He greets you with a practiced, courteous nod, his gaze briefly appraising your reaction. His eyes, though refined, hold a cool and calculating sharpness. He gestures gracefully toward one particular portrait, draped in shadow, its presence unmistakably central to the room. He pulls back the curtains. That's my last Duchess, painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. The woman depicted is young and beautiful, her smile soft and her expression gently inviting. Yet the Duke's curious choice of words, my last Duchess, echoes with unsettling possessiveness. Beneath this carefully cultivated politeness lurks an iron hand, a jealous pride that seems ready to tighten at any perceived slight. As you look closer at the Duchess's face, an unease grows, a suspicion about the man who stands beside you. Those impeccable manners, his refined speech, his understated control, every gesture and every syllable exudes authority wrapped in civility, masking resolve beneath velvet gloves. Who exactly was this Duchess? Why does her image now exist only within a frame, behind a curtain drawn and revealed only at her husband's whim? Welcome to the carefully controlled, quietly menacing world of Robert Browning's My Last Duchess, a dramatic monologue that masterfully peels back layers of charm to reveal chilling depths of authoritarian patriarchal power, sexual jealousy, and absolute control. So, welcome. Today we're exploring the poem My Last Duchess by Robert Browning. Now, this is a poem first published in 1842 that's a dramatic monologue, and this is actually a poetic form that Browning mastered. Remember, just as a bit of recap, a dramatic monologue is one where we hear one speaker's voice, think mono, throughout. The voice of a character who, importantly, is not the poet. And through this one-sided conversation, a conversation in this case dominated by the voice of the Duke, we come to understand something of the speaker's personality and their situation. Here, our speaker is an Italian Duke, and Browning even gives us a clue as to his identity, with the single word that heads the poem, Ferrara. Now, Ferrara is a region in Renaissance Italy, very important in Renaissance Italy, and with that title, Browning signals that the Duke of Ferrara is the one who's doing the talking. Now, it seems that, and this is not wildly important, but perhaps worth knowing in passing, that Browning likely had a real Duke, Duke Alfonso II of Ferrara, and there's some suggestion that the real Duke of Ferrara, this Duke Alfonso, that his young wife died under suspicious circumstances. But it's important to remember that Browning isn't writing a history lesson. He's using this Renaissance setting to explore issues very relevant to Victorian society, the society in which he was existing and writing, but also to some timeless issues. The oppression of women. These are issues that are still very much alive today in 2025. The corrupting effects and thirst for power and the relationship between art and morality. As we listen to the Duke's polished speech, Browning invites us to read between the lines, to hear what the Duke is not openly saying. The result in this poem is a chilling character study delivered in some of the most elegant verse we might hope to read. So in today's episode, we're delving into the poem line by line, thinking about how Browning uses language, form, and tone to gradually reveal the Duke's true character. Throughout this poetic journey, I'm going to be drawing directly from the poem and thinking deeply about our analysis so that we can hear Browning's words and interpret them in ways that are going to help us in our exam and in our broader understanding of this text. So, let's start at the beginning. The Duke begins casually, even pleasantly. "That's my last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive." Right from the start, Browning packs these seemingly simple lines with meaning. They're pregnant with meaning. The Duke says, "That's my last Duchess," as if he's introducing, obviously, this artwork to a guest. The word last here means previous, his former wife, but it also hints at a sense of finality, suggesting an ominous story behind why she's no longer with him. And the painting on the wall, looking as if she were alive, tells us that the Duchess is not alive, she's present only in the art. There's a touch of dramatic irony here. The Duke's tone is offhand and proud, but we listeners immediately sense something is amiss, something doesn't seem quite right. Why is he talking about her as if she's just an object in his collection? The casual way he notes that she looks almost alive is very, very interesting. There's a kind of wicked dramatic irony to this, because the Duke himself caused her to become a lifeless object, something that we'll be thinking about later. She's a painting. At this point, on a first reading, we might not yet realise the Duchess is dead, or maybe some of the circumstances around her death. But Browning drops us a clue when the Duke's remark is more eerie than it is affectionate. Notice also the Duke's choice of pronoun, "my last Duchess." In just 3 words, he conveys ownership. She is his, a possession, a trophy on the wall. This possessive attitude will only grow stronger as the monologue develops. Already, the power dynamic is established. The Duke speaks as one who controls how his late wife is represented, literally controlling who gets to see her portrait. He's the one who decides who puts the curtain back. We as listeners are put in the position of the silent guest to whom he shows the painting. Now, the Duke turns our attention to the artist who created this portrait. He says, "I call that piece a wonder. Now, Frau Pandolf's hands worked busily a day, and there she stands." Here, the tone is admiring. He calls the painting a wonder. He even names the artist, Frau Pandolf, who Browning hints is some sort of famous painter. The name, incidentally, is fictional, but perhaps sounds like some renowned artist or monk artist. The Duke mentions Frau Pandolf deliberately, by design, as he later says, to impress his listener. It's as if he's saying, "This portrait is valuable. I had it done by the great Frau Pandolf." Why might the Duke be so eager to name-drop the artist? Perhaps it's to show off his wealth and his taste. He treats the painting as some kind of status symbol, something that adds to his sense of prestige. There's irony, too, in calling the painting a wonder now. Does he mean it's a wonder now that she's gone, whereas perhaps he didn't fully appreciate her when she was alive? The phrasing hints that only after the Duchess's death does he truly value this image of her. It's a subtle suggestion that he prefers the portrait, which he can control, to the living woman, whom, from his perspective, he could not fully control. Also notice Browning's use of enjambment here. I call that piece a wonder now, Fra Pandolf's hands worked busily a day, and there she stands. The sentence, the line flows over the line break without a pause. There, Fra Pandolf's hands worked busily. Browning's lines often run on like this, and we call that technique enjambment, which makes the Duke's speech sound natural and conversational. There's no sing-song pause at the end of each line, even though the poem does have a strict rhyming couplet structure. Because of the enjambment, the rhymes, wall, call, and so on, aren't immediately obvious. This formal structure, tight rhyme, but beneath a flowing speech, mirrors perhaps the Duke's character. Outwardly smooth and controlled, but underneath there's a tightly wound, relentless drive as he reveals more than he perhaps intends. Let's think about the next few lines. Will please you sit and look at her? Here, the Duke directly addresses his guest, and by extension, us as listeners or as readers, with a courteous invitation to sit and admire the portrait, or seemingly courteous. His politeness, will it please you, is the polished etiquette of a nobleman, and also a subtle command, but it's masked as a question. One can imagine the guest feeling that they have little choice but to oblige the powerful Duke. In performance, when read aloud, we might even hear the Duke's hand gesturing to a chair or seeing a proud smile on his face if an actor is delivering this as a monologue. The dramatic monologue form means, of course, we only get the Duke's words, but Browning cleverly lets us infer the silent listener's presence from lines like this. The Duke says he said Fra Pandolf by design because he knows that any, perhaps strangers like you, some sort of emissary, would turn and ask how such a glance came there. In other words, whenever anyone new sees the Duchess's painting, they invariably are struck by her passionate glance and blush in the portrait, and they want to ask the Duke about it, though they dare not ask outright. Why is that? What is it about the Duchess's painted expression that would prompt such curious questions? Browning, of course, doesn't show us the painting directly, but through the Duke's words, we learn the Duchess in the portrait has a look of deep emotion, quote, the depth and passion of its earnest glance, and a spot of joy, a blush on her cheeks. People wonder what or who caused that rosy glow. The Duke, anticipating the question, tells us that he alone pulls back the curtain to show the portrait. This is in line 9, since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you but I. This detail is very revealing. The Duke keeps his late wife's painting behind a curtain, and no one gets to see it unless he permits. Think about that. Even in death, or in art, he controls who gets access to her image. This is symbolic of his desire to control her completely. In life, he couldn't control all her smiles and interactions, but now he has literally objectified her, made her into an object on the wall, and he can physically draw a curtain to hide or display her at his choosing, at his whim. The power dynamic is almost eerie. The Duchess's lively expression is frozen in time, and the Duke can now possess her in a way he couldn't when she was alive. The curtain is also a metaphor for secrecy and mystery. He is letting the envoy, and us as readers, behind the veil, both literally to see the painting and metaphorically or figuratively to hear the story of what has happened. The Duke continues, explaining the Duchess's cheerful nature, while trying to appear calm, detached, and objective. He says, "'Twas not her husband's presence only called that spot of joy into the Duchess's cheek. Perhaps Fra Pandolf chanced to say, her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much, or paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half-flush that dies along her throat." Let's break this down. He starts with, "Sir, 'twas not her husband's presence only called that spot of joy into the Duchess's cheek." He's effectively saying here, it wasn't just my presence that made her blush. The Duke is acknowledging, maybe with a hint of irritation and perhaps some note of sexual jealousy, that the Duchess's rosy cheeks in the portrait weren't solely due to him. Perhaps a compliment from the painter caused it. He imagines what Fra Pandolf might have said to her as he painted. Maybe the painter politely remarked, "Your shawl covers your wrist too much," or flattered her by saying, "Paint could never hope to capture the fading blush on your throat." These hypothetical quotes are delivered in the Duke's voice, but they're meant to be what Fra Pandolf might have said to make the Duchess smile and blush. The section here drips with dramatic irony and sexual jealousy. The Duke is conjuring up a scenario in which the painter said something completely innocuous, basically gentle flattery or polite small talk. Browning uses phrases typical of courtly courtesy. A Renaissance painter would say such things maybe to put a sitter at ease, to make them feel relaxed and comfortable. And the Duchess, being good-natured, blushes at the compliments. She interprets such stuff as courtesy, and thus cause enough for calling up that spot of joy. These idea that these little comments were just kindness, and they pleased her. The Duke's tone, however, is scornful when recounting this. You can almost hear him spitting out. Such stuff was courtesy, she thought. He considers her naive for being so pleased by simple politeness. And then let's turn to the next set of lines. She had a heart. How shall I say? Too soon made glad, too easily impressed. She liked whate'er she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. This is the Duke's assessment of his late wife, of his deceased wife. Listening to the phrasing, too soon made glad, too easily impressed, he's criticizing her for being too appreciative, too quick to smile at little things. The rhetorical question, how shall I say, followed by the self-interruption, is an example of caesura, a break or pause in the middle of a line. Browning writes, a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad, with those dashes indicating the Duke pausing, as if choosing his words very carefully. It's a performative pause. The Duke maybe wants to appear tactful or reluctant to criticize, how shall I say, but he can't hide his annoyance. The use of caesura here gives a sense of suppressed, barely suppressed agitation. He must voice his displeasure with her, yet he pretends it's hard to articulate. This pretense, this fiction, fools no one but himself. We, as readers, hear his contempt. He continues, she liked whate'er she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. The alliteration sound in the L sound in liked, looked, looks, draws our attention to how often he mentions her looking around. It suggests he thought she gave her attention freely, too freely, to anything and anyone, rather than reserving special admiration to him. For the Duke, this is a flaw. Pause and consider. Is it necessarily a bad thing that the Duchess was easily made happy? In a different light, this line portrays the Duchess as a sort of kind, joyful soul. She finds delight in simple things, sunsets, sweet fruits, a ride on her mule. She treats people with gratitude and warmth. These qualities would normally be virtues. However, in the Duke's evidently patriarchal view, a Duchess should be more reserved, bestowing her smiles and gratitude only where it's proper, chiefly on him and what he provides. His pride cannot stand that he didn't have exclusive control over her happiness. Here, Browning invites us to see the stark inequity of gender expectations. The Duke feels his wife should have behaved according to his standards of decorum, reflecting the Victorian and also Renaissance ideal that a woman, especially a wife, ought to be modest, submissive, and singularly or only devoted to her lord and husband. The Duchess's maybe innocent friendliness is to the Duke a slight to his authority and his ego. In these lines, we also get a real important glimpse of one of the major themes of this poem: power and control. The Duke craves control over how the Duchess feels and interacts. When he says her looks went everywhere, he's essentially complaining that he couldn't control where she looked or who she smiled at. This foreshadows the lengths he might go to regain that control. Browning is subtly laying out the Duke's psyche here, an unstable mix of pride, jealousy, and perhaps sexual insecurity hiding beneath aristocratic politeness. Now the Duke elaborates with specific examples of the Duchess's behaviour that upset him. He says, "'Twas all one, sir, 'twas all one, my favour at her breast. The dropping of the daylight in the west, the bough of cherries, some officious fool broke in the orchard for her. The white mule she rode with round the terrace, all and each would draw from her alike the approving speech, or blush at least." He lists a series of things that would please her, and he emphasises that to her 'twas all one. In other words, she treated all these things equally with the same level of delight. Let's examine that list. My favour at her breast. Now, this is likely some sort of brooch or gift he gave her to wear as a mark of his esteem or love. A favour could be like a ribbon or some sort of token from the Duke. This symbolises his love or the noble gift of marriage. We imagine she wore something he gave her. The dropping of the daylight in the west. It's a poetic way of saying sunset. Even a beautiful sunset has made her happy. The bough of cherries, some officious fool broke in the orchard for her. A thoughtful, if maybe a clumsy servant, or maybe a child, we don't know, picked some cherries and gave them to her. He calls this person an officious fool. Clearly, he despised anyone else doing favours for her or making her smile. The white mule she rode with round the terrace. So, the mule she had and the act of riding around their estate. All these things, from the grand, the Duke's favour, to the simple, sunset, cherries, and mule ride, would elicit or produce the same approving speech or blush at least. She would thank people, she would compliment the sunset, she would blush with pleasure. To the Duke, 'twas all one, it was all the same to her. You can almost hear the indignation in his voice as he stresses that his gift of a 900 years old name got no more attention than these apparently trivial things. In his mind, this is a great insult. The phrase, my favour at her breast, is placed pointedly right next to the sunset and the cherries in that list to underline how equal her reactions were. She didn't distinguish between the great honour of being his Duchess and those small joys of life. This is a key insight into the Duke's character and the theme of pride and social status. The Duke clearly comes from an ancient and prestigious family, a 900 years old name, as he later reminds us in line 33. In that aristocratic patriarchal worldview, the Duchess should consider that name and the status he gives her as an extraordinary gift from him. Her failure to treat it as supremely special is to him a form of deep disrespect. It's as if he's thinking, how dare she value a mere sunset or a kind gesture from a nobody as much as she values being my wife? This outrage might make us, as modern listeners in 2025, recoil. The Duke's ego is enormous. He cannot tolerate that his wife had a mind and a heart of her own, independent of his prestige. Let's pause and ask, do we actually see any evidence that the Duchess did anything truly wrong? All the Duke has described is her kindness. her gratitude, her evident capacity for joy. She thanked men, even concedes good, as he narrates, implying it's fine that she was courteous. But thanks somehow as if she ranked my gift of a 900 years old name with anybody's gift. The Duke can't even articulate how she showed this lack of distinction. I know not how, he says. Just that to him it felt as if she equated him with the rest. This is telling. He doesn't really have a concrete example of her misbehaviour, maybe sort of adulterous behaviour. It's only his perception of being slighted. This suggests to the reader the problem lies in the Duke's jealousy, his controlling nature, not in any actual specific wrongdoing by the Duchess. Browning is crafting a classic case of an unreliable narrator. The Duke is describing events in a way that is meant to justify himself, but the more he speaks, the more we suspect as readers that his perspective is the one that's distorted. He's revealing more about his own flaws than about hers. The Duke's unreliability comes through strongly in the next lines. He ponders whether he should have just talked to the Duchess about her behaviour. He says, "Who'd stoop to blame this sort of trifling, even had you skill in speech, which I have not, to make your will quite clear to such an one, and say, just this or that in you disgusts me, here you miss or there exceed the mark, and if she let herself be lessons so, nor plainly set her wits to yours forsooth, and made excuse, e'en then would be some stooping, and I choose never to stoop." This is a crucial passage for understanding the Duke. First, the rhetorical question, who'd stoop to blame this sort of trifling? He's basically saying here, would anyone of my rank, my level of nobility, lower themselves to even scold her, tell her off for these petty things? The word stoop is repeated, emphasizing how he sees addressing the issue as beneath him. It's not for someone like him to be doing this. He considers her smiling at others to be trifling, trivial, unimportant, and yet, ironically, it bothers him immensely. The Duke then creates a hypothetical scenario, even if he had the skill to speak to her about it, and here he pretends modesty with that which I have not, his blatant lie, since he's very skilled in persuasive speech, as we can tell, and even if he could spell out just this or that in you disgusts me, and if she let herself be lessoned, if she agreed to be taught how to behave, and if she didn't fight back or make excuses, even then, he said, that would be some stooping, and he chooses never to stoop. This section of the poem is very, very important. The Duke's arrogance reaches a kind of peak or culmination here. He's essentially saying, I refuse to lower myself by explaining or asking her to change. It's her job to know what I want without my saying and to obey accordingly. If I had to tell her off, I'd be demeaning myself. And that word stoop, it underscores his pride. He sees himself as so superior that communicating honestly with his wife would somehow compromise his dignity. It's also ironic. The very act of delivering this long justification to the emissary and to the reader is itself a little bit undignified. He's obsessively recounting these grievances. But the Duke doesn't see it that way. He believes he's showing how reasonable he was in not confronting her. So there's a sense of entitlement and patriarchy laid bare. The Duke expected silent obedience and perfection from the Duchess, without any guidance or discussion. In the context of Renaissance nobility, and similarly in Victorian times when Browning wrote the poem, wives were often expected to be seen but not heard, to bring honour to their husbands, certainly not to question them. Yet, if the Duke were a loving husband, he might have gently spoken to his wife about his feelings. The fact that he refuses to communicate, calling it lessoning her, or teach her a lesson, shows he never saw her as an equal partner in the marriage. To him, she was an object to be owned, not a person to be reasoned with. Browning here is highlighting the poisonous pride of the Duke, which is so extreme it leads to disaster. And what was that disaster? The Duke has been dancing around it, but now he finally implies what happened in chillingly terse language. Listen carefully to the next lines, as the Duke's tone shifts to something cold and final. "Oh, sir, she smiled, no doubt, whene'er I passed her, but who passed without much the same smile? This grew. I gave commands. Then all smiles stopped together. There she stands, as if alive." Wow, this is a bombshell. Let's unpack it. He begins almost nostalgically. "She smiled, no doubt, whene'er I passed her. The Duchess did smile at him, as a good wife should. But who passed without much the same smile?" he asks rhetorically. In other words, she smiled at everyone, from his perspective, in the same way. And, from his perspective, her warmth was not reserved for him. And that is unacceptable. Then we get the hammer blow. "This grew. I gave commands. Then all smiles stopped together." That line sends a shiver down the spine of the reader. The Duke glosses over the details with chilling brevity. "This grew" implies that his irritation, or her behaviour, in his view, continued to grow. We can imagine the Duke's jealousy and rage growing unchecked, since he chose never to stoop, and that he never actually wants to speak to her or discuss the problem. The phrase, "I gave commands, then all smiles stopped," is a frighteningly euphemistic way to describe what is almost certainly the murder of the Duchess. Browning, and this is a masterstroke, doesn't spell it out explicitly. He lets us as readers try to connect the dots. The Duke gave commands. To whom? Servants, agents, an assassin, a doctor, and as a result, the Duchess's smiles stopped. Forever. She's dead. This is the climax of the dramatic monologue, the moment of truth of the Duke's character crystallizing for the reader. If there were any doubt before, it's now clear that this apparently refined art-collecting Duke is in fact a killer, or at least responsible for his wife's death. This is a prime example of dramatic irony. Throughout the poem, he's been condemning her for trivial faults, trying to convince the listener of his justification, but the reader sees the horror of what he's saying, even if he doesn't openly acknowledge it. The Duke delivers this line in such a matter-of-fact way, without any sign of guilt or even grief. To him, it seems, the solution was straightforward. She displeased him, so he disposed of her. Now all her troublesome smiles, the ones that apparently she's giving away too freely, have stopped. They've ceased. We're left as readers to try to imagine the specifics. Did he order her murder outright? Did he perhaps command she be locked away somewhere or poisoned? Browning leaves it ambiguous, which in a way makes it even more chilling, because our imagination fills in the worst. The key point here is the Duke's utter lack of remorse. Then all smiles stopped together. Full stop. In that pause, you might feel the air in the gallery grow cold. The Duke has effectively admitted to something terrible. And yet in the very next breath he continues on as though nothing were amiss. "There she stands as if alive. Will please you rise? We'll meet the company below then." Just like that, he turns back to his guest and the business at hand. There she stands as if alive. He's referring to the portrait again, noting how lifelike it is. A final compliment to the art, as if that's what matters. Then he politely but briskly moves on. "Will you please stand up? Let's go meet the others downstairs." The sudden shift from the dark confession to polite hosting, it's really jarring. It highlights the Duke's callousness and perhaps how thoroughly he compartmentalizes his life. The Duchess is just a portrait now, and he can brag about how realistic it looks, then escort his guest away, as if they'd merely been discussing the weather. It's also a sign of his confidence and arrogance. He doesn't fear any consequences from revealing the story. Possibly he assumes the emissary wouldn't dare react with shock. After all, the Duke is the one in control here, socially and physically. The emissary is a representative of another noble negotiating a marriage. Are they really going to challenge the Duke about his hinted at crime? The Duke might even be testing the waters, showing a bit of his ruthless side to signal what could happen if he's displeased in the next marriage. It's a subtle intimidation. He's effectively saying, "This is how I deal with disobedience." Now, the Duke focuses on the marriage negotiations directly for the first time in the poem. I repeat, the Count your master's known munificence is ample warrant that no just pretence of mine for dowry will be disallowed, though his fair daughter's self, as I avowed at starting, is my object. He addresses the envoy about the envoy's master, the Count, the father of the Duke's prospective bride. He remarks on the Count's known munificence, that is, everyone knows the Count is very generous. This, the Duke says, is a guarantee, or to use the word from the poem, a warrant, that any reasonable demand he makes for a dowry will not be refused. Essentially, the Duke is coolly discussing the financial transaction of the new marriage. He's confident that the dowry, the money, property, or gifts the bride's family will give to him upon marriage, will meet his expectations, given the father's generosity. He phrases it, though, rather diplomatically. No just pretense of mine for dowry will be disallowed. But it's really clear here, he's quite concerned about securing a good dowry. Only after stating this does he add, though his fair daughter's self is my object. He's saying, of course, I'm primarily interested in the daughter herself, as I said in the beginning, but just to be clear, I do expect the dowry to be adequate. This part here can be a bit tricky, but it shows the Duke's priorities. He reduces the future bride to a sort of bargaining chip while pretending that she's the real prize. The word object here is very telling. He calls the Count's daughter my object. He means objective or desire, but it also rings as if she is an object, a thing to be bought or sold, to be owned. Throughout the poem, the Duke has objectified women. His last Duchess was a possession whose image he now literally owns, and this new girl, new woman being evaluated in terms of what she brings, herself and her dowry. It underscores the theme of women as property, the commodification of women, we might say, in patriarchal societies. The Duke's attitude reflects how, historically, aristocratic marriages were almost always transactions of power and of wealth. Love was often secondary, if indeed any part of the equation. In the Duke's case, emotional warmth is not just secondary, it's unwelcome unless it fits his exact standards. So Browning, writing in Victorian times, might be implicitly critiquing how women had very little agency or control in these sorts of matters, both in the Renaissance and in his own 19th century society. Victorian readers would recognise the scenario: a wealthy man negotiating for a young bride, concerned about money and about status. They might also catch Browning's ironic contrast between the Duke's outward civility and his inner cruelty. It's a critique of the kind of toxic masculinity and aristocratic privilege that treated wives as dispensable possessions. Browning's choice to put this story in Renaissance Italy gives the poet some cover to discuss these social issues. He could explore the darkest corners and recesses of male dominance, but at a safe historical remove from Victorian England. But of course, it does parallel his own time's gender dynamics. They're there in the poem. In fact, Browning often wrote from the perspective of villainous or misogynistic characters, like in this case the Duke, not because he agreed with them, but actually as a way to expose and criticise their attitudes. The Duke is, in fact, in many ways the antithesis of Browning's own values. We know Browning was a loving husband to the poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning, quite the opposite of the cold Duke, and by, we might say, ventriloquising such a character, Browning forces us as readers to confront the horror of those patriarchal values taken to extremes.
The Duke has one more surprise for us, delivered as they leave the scene of the painting. In the final lines of the poem, as he and the envoy prepare to go downstairs, the Duke nonchalantly draws attention to another art piece, in his collection. Nay, we'll go together down, sir. Notice Neptune, though, taming a seahorse, thought a rarity which Claus of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me. Now this is astonishing. The Duke has just effectively admitted to causing or being deeply involved in his wife's death, yet he doesn't want to depart without bragging about one more expensive artwork. The Duke points out a bronze statue of Neptune taming a seahorse, made for him by Claus of Innsbruck, another artist name Browning made up to sound like a famous sculptor. Neptune is the Roman god of the sea, often depicted controlling or subduing sea creatures. This little detail right at the end of the poem serves, I think, as a powerful symbol. Think about Neptune taming a wild seahorse. It's a mythological image of power and of domination. The Duke likely identifies with Neptune. Just as Neptune dominates the creature, the Duke believes in taming those around him, in particular, it seems, his wives. The previous Duchess could be likened to that seahorse, a natural, joyful creature that the Duke tried to tame and ultimately silenced. That he considers this statue a rarity and showcases it proudly is no accident. Browning is using it to reinforce the theme of art as a tool of power. The Duke collects art, paintings, sculptures, that either capture beauty or, in this case, depict domination. It's as if his love of art and his need for control intersect or are intermingled. He couldn't control the living Duchess's smiles, but now he controls her painted image. He admires, deeply admires it seems, a statue of a god exerting control over an animal. The placement of this reference at the very end of the poem does leave us as readers pondering the question, does the Duke view women as creatures to be tamed? The fact that he shifts to this topic at the end might also show his shallowness or maybe even his callousness. He's more comfortable talking about art objects than about feelings or moral consequences. It's a final, chilling note that underlines the Duke's value system: beauty, possession, dominance. People, like his Duchess, become things to collect or to subdue. We should also note Browning's clever structure here. The poem begins and ends with art objects, a painting of the Duchess at the start and a sculpture at the end. This framing makes the poem itself something like a tour through the Duke's gallery and through his twisted mind. It starts with "My last Duchess on the wall" and ends with "Neptune cast in bronze for me." In between, we've learned why that Duchess is now just a painting. The Duke's tour of his art is simultaneously, it seems, a confession of his crime. Browning's use of the dramatic monologue form allows this slow reveal. We begin, perhaps, in admiration and end in horror. As the Duke and the envoy descend the staircase to join the others, as readers we're left alone for a moment. Imagine ourselves stood in front of the portrait of the Duchess. Can you picture her? A young woman with a sweet smile, a blush on her cheeks, kind eyes that went everywhere. She enjoyed the simple pleasures of life and greeted everyone with warmth. Now, eternally still on the wall, she stands as if alive, under the gaze and control of a husband who never appreciated her living spirit. The tragedy, then, of My Last Duchess lies in what is not directly said: the silencing of a woman's voice and the chilling ease with which a powerful man justifies it. Browning doesn't give the Duchess a single line of dialogue. She is completely silent in this poem, just as she is in death. Yet, through the Duke's monologue, her fate speaks volumes about the consequences of unchecked power, particularly male power, and pride. Browning's poem, then, is a masterclass in dramatic irony. The Duke speaks to impress and persuade his listener, and by extension the reader, that he was in the right, that his late wife was the problem. But Browning has structured the language and the details in the poem so that we feel we can see the real story between the lines. This technique engages us on a psychological level as readers. We must infer the truth, becoming something a little bit like a detective or maybe even a judge of the Duke's tale. In doing so, we're drawn into a deeper consideration of the poem's themes and big ideas. We ask ourselves questions. Are we more horrified by the Duke's actions or oddly fascinated by his polished delivery and the beautiful imagery of the poem? After all, we've been listening to the Duke's charming voice describe something appalling. Does the aesthetic pleasure of the poetry make us momentarily forget the moral repugnance of what he's done? Browning subtly challenges us. Should art merely be admired, or should we also judge the content it conveys? In My Last Duchess, the form, a gracefully controlled poetic form, and the content, a story of immoral control and murder, are in tension. This tension is intentional, prompting us to think critically about the Duke and what he represents. So, My Last Duchess ultimately explores themes of power, control, jealousy, pride, and also gender roles through this disturbing voice of the Duke. The speaker is both a character but also a symbol. He represents an extreme of patriarchal authority, a man who sees his wife as a possession that failed to meet his expectations of obedience and exclusivity, and who would rather destroy her than stoop to equality or some kind of emotional understanding. His jealousy is not the wild, passionate kind, at least not on the surface. It's cold and ego-driven. He couldn't stand that her looks went everywhere, whatever that might actually mean, and obviously not solely giving those looks just to him. The theme of power is evident as he exercises the ultimate power over her life and death, and even after death, over her image. Art in the poem is an instrument of that power. The portrait and statue are testaments to what the Duke values. The portrait keeps the Duchess available yet under his lock and key. The statue of Neptune taming a creature reflects his worldview that might and domination are something to be proud of. The theme of gender is also central. The Duchess's only faults were actually qualities that would be praised in anyone else, but because she was a woman, under a tyrannical husband, those qualities become fatal. Browning, writing in the Victorian era, subtly warns how such attitudes, treating women as inferiors or objects to be controlled and possessed, can lead to dehumanization and violence. Victorian readers would recognize in the Duke's Renaissance world a caricature of their own society's patriarchal excesses, and indeed, perhaps it gets us to think about our world in 2025 too. So as we conclude our tour of this poem, think about the irony that's in the Duke's presentation. He intends to impress the envoy, and indeed us as readers, with his sophistication, his art, and his tragic loss of a apparently foolish wife. Instead, we walk away as readers impressed only by Browning's skill in revealing the ugly truth. The Duke's monologue has allowed us, interestingly, to see his portrait, not just the one painted on a wall, but a psychological portrait painted in words, and it's not a flattering picture. Browning leaves us with an image of the Duke as a supremely cultured villain, a man who speaks of ancient names and rare artworks, who can charm with courteous phrases, and who casually mentions murder in the same tone as discussing dowry and sculpture. This dramatic irony is what makes this poem so fascinating and haunting. So, the poem pulls us then into a beautiful Renaissance gallery to witness a silent painting and a loquacious Duke, and by the time we step out, we've experienced a story of human darkness told through poetic brilliance. Browning's invitation to engage with the poem as both an artwork and as a moral tale lingers. If we were the envoy, hearing the Duke's words echo off the marble walls, would we dare to react? Would we run to warn the next Duchess? The poem, of course, doesn't answer these questions, but it certainly leaves us with a lot to ponder. And as always, I hope this podcast episode 2 has given you a lot to think about this wonderful, rich, interesting, and chilling poem. So until next time, I hope you found this episode really useful. Keep working hard, keep focusing on your revision, and I'll see you in the next episode.